The orphan boy who wrote his own funeral letter in 1892 Illinois. It was the kind of town where nothing ever seemed to change. The dirt roads stayed muddy in spring, and the church bell still tolled the same way it had for decades. Children ran through cornfields in summer. Farmers tipped their hats to neighbors they'd known their whole lives. On the surface, 1892 Illinois was ordinary. Too ordinary. But behind lace curtains and candlelit windows, whispers spread about a tragedy no one could forget. It wasn't about a fire, or a flood, or a wandering stranger. It was about a boy, an orphan boy, a child who carried a secret so heavy that he wrote it down, sealed it in words, and titled it his own funeral letter. Who was he? Why would a child prepare for his own death? The answers would haunt this town for generations. The boy's name never traveled far. Not in newspapers, not in ledgers. He was just another nameless child swallowed by the system. An orphanage ward tucked away in the corner of Illinois. The town had many like him. Children left behind by plague, poverty, or accident. Some were sent by desperate families who could no longer afford another mouth to feed. Others were abandoned outright, left on the steps of the church or the creaking gates of the orphanage. But this boy was different. His silence carried weight. He didn't cry for attention. He didn't beg for food or affection. Instead, he watched, eyes too old for his young face. He noticed things that grown men in town chose not to see. On cold evenings, when the winds swept across the prairie and rattled the window frames, he would sit by candlelight with a scrap of paper. He wrote carefully, as if every word mattered. And they did. Because he wasn't writing stories. He was writing instructions. Instructions for the day his body would be lowered into the ground. Imagine that for a moment. A child planning his own burial. Deciding what words would be read, which one would be sung, who should and should not stand by his grave. The town would later call it chilling, unholy, proof that something was wrong in that orphanage. But at the time, nobody noticed the boy bent over his paper, pressing his small hand into each desperate sentence. Illinois in 1892 was not kind to orphans. The state was filled with institutions, cold brick buildings built to manage the children society had forgotten. There were no mothers to kiss them goodnight, no fathers to steady their trembling hands. Just strict matrons, stern rules, and the sound of footsteps echoing through endless hallways. And yet, this boy's fate was darker than most. Because he didn't just live inside the orphanage. He carried a secret about it. A secret he believed would only come out when he was gone. That's why he wrote the letter. That's why he planned his own funeral. He knew death was coming. Some in town later claimed they had seen it in his eyes, that strange heaviness, as if he already belonged to another world. Others swore they had seen bruises on his arms or a limp in his walk. But at the time, they did nothing. They let the silence of the orphanage walls swallow his cries. Until the day the letter surfaced. The funeral stopped the town in its tracks. People gathered at the small wooden chapel, clutching their hats and their children's hands. The coffin was small, too small, and on top of it lay the letter. It wasn't read aloud to all, but whispers traveled fast. The boy had written it himself. Every word, every chilling detail, the kind of letter no child should ever have to write. It begged the question, what had happened inside those walls? The town would never fully agree. Some said it was the cruelty of the orphanage. Others claimed it was despair that drove him. But whatever the truth, the letter became a ghost. A reminder that even in a quiet Illinois town, darkness could live in plain sight. And it all began with that boy. Unnamed, unseen, yet unforgettable. The coffin was lowered into the ground beneath a gray Illinois sky. The wind cut sharp across the prairie, rattling the bare branches like brittle bones. Villagers stood in silence, their boots sinking into the damp earth. No mother wept. No father placed a trembling hand upon the wood. No family stood close enough to claim him. He was buried, as so many orphans were in the 19th century, alone. Yet this boy was different. His grave was not just another mound of soil in a forgotten corner of the cemetery. His burial carried weight because of what lay inside his final letter. A letter no child should have written. A letter that said more about the world of orphans than any preacher's sermon ever could. Who was this child? His name slipped through records like water through fingers. The town's orphanage ledger marked him only as admitted, male, age uncertain. No relatives were listed. No baptismal record was found. He entered life's final chapter already nameless, already abandoned. The people of town whispered. Some believe his family had died of illness during the influenza waves that tore through Illinois in the late 1880s. Others claimed his parents were still alive, but too poor to care for him. Farmers who had given him up with the promise he'd find food and shelter in the institution. But no one came forward at the funeral. Not a single blood relative stood to say, "He is ours." And so, the boy became the town's unwanted shadow. The tragedy was not just that he died young. It was that, in life, he had belonged to no one. In the orphanage, children without parents were often treated as little more than labor. They scrubbed the halls. They worked the fields. They stitched torn sheets until their fingers bled. Affection was scarce. A smile from caretaker was rare. And for a child like him, quiet, withdrawn, already carrying grief, there was even less. The matrons whispered that he kept to himself. The other boys teased him, called him strange. He didn't fight back. He only wrote. Scraps of notes, words too heavy for his age. On stormy nights, when thunder rolled across the prairie, children huddled together for comfort. But he sat alone on his bed, a thin blanket wrapped around his shoulders, eyes staring out into the rain. What thoughts filled his head? The matrons said he prayed too much. The boys said he dreamed too dark. But what none of them knew was that he was planning, carefully, silently, the details of his own end. And in those details lay his one act of control. At the funeral, whispers spread about the letter. It wasn't a suicide note, not in the way people expected. It was a will, a child's will. He wrote about the hymns that should be sung, about how his coffin should be closed, about who should stay away from the service. He even asked that no flowers be placed, as if beauty had no place in his memory. This was not the writing of a boy filled with childish imagination. This was the voice of someone who had lived too much sorrow, who had stared death in the face and found it less frightening than. The absence of family made the letter even more haunting. If no one claimed him in life, why did he care so deeply about how he would be remembered in death? Perhaps because he knew the truth, that memory was all he had left. A child's funeral should be filled with love, with tears from the people who knew every detail of his life. His was filled instead with silence, broken only by the shifting of boots in the mud and the muttered prayers of strangers. And when the coffin was covered with earth, the boy disappeared not only from the living, but from the town's conscience. No family demanded answers. No one fought for his memory. He was a ghost before he was even lowered into the ground. But ghosts have a way of lingering. And this boy's letter was the echo he left behind, a warning carved into paper. It would be years before anyone realized what his words truly meant. The orphanage stood on the edge of town like a scar on the land. Its brick walls loomed above the prairie, cold and unwelcoming, a fortress meant not for love but for order. From a distance, it looked respectable, a place of charity where abandoned children were given shelter and food. But up close, it reeked of something else. Damp hallways, mold creeping across ceilings, iron locks on doors that should never have needed locks. To outsiders, it was a Christian institution. To the children inside, it was a cage. Orphanages in 1890s Illinois were filled to the brim. Epidemics had swept away parents. Factories chewed up fathers. Poverty swallowed mothers whole. Towns couldn't keep up. So they built places like this, warehouses for the unwanted. The boy who wrote his own funeral letter had lived in those walls for years. And within them, he had learned one terrible truth. Life in the orphanage was not life at all. It was survival. Children marched in silence from dormitory to chapel, from chapel to dining hall, from dining hall to labor. They rose before dawn, often to the sound of a bell, and spent their days scrubbing floors until their knuckles turned raw, or picking crops in the orphanage's fields until their backs ached. Food was thin, bowls of watery stew, crusts of stale bread. Enough to keep them alive, not enough to let them grow strong. And punishments were always waiting. A missed chore, a word spoken out of turn, a tear shed when no tears were allowed. Each earned a strike across the knuckles, a slap to the face, or in the worst cases, days of solitary confinement in a windowless room where silence pressed heavier than chains. The boy endured it all, but he didn't cry. That was what unnerved the others. He never flinched when a cane struck. He never begged when his stomach growled. He never tried to run like some of the other boys who escaped only to be dragged back by sheriffs. Instead, he wrote, words hidden in scraps of paper, folded beneath the thin mattress of his bed. Some said the matrons found his writings once and burned them. Others claimed they encouraged him, saying it was good for the soul to confess on paper. Whatever the truth, his writing became his only refuge, and eventually his writing became his death. The other children whispered about strange happenings at night, footsteps echoing down halls when no one was there, a matron's lantern swaying like a ghost's light, whimpers coming from locked rooms. They swore the orphanage was haunted, not by spirits of the dead, but by the suffering of the living. The boy knew those shadows better than anyone. He felt them pressing against him at night, heavy and suffocating. He heard the cries through the walls, children punished for reasons that made no sense. He saw what was done in the dark corners of the orphanage, things never spoken aloud in daylight. And he understood something that others refused to admit. This was not a home. This was a place that buried children alive. That was why his funeral letter mattered. It wasn't just about his own death. It was a testimony. His last desperate attempt to shine a lantern into the shadows of the orphanage, to show the world what had been done to him and to so many others. But the cruelest truth was this. When his letter was discovered, the matrons dismissed it. They called it the ramblings of a troubled child. The townsfolk whispered, pitied, and then moved on. The orphanage doors stayed locked. The children's footsteps still marched in silence, and the shadows deepened. The boy's voice, though, did not vanish completely. It lingered, in the creak of the floorboards, in the cries the other children swore they heard long after he was gone, in the stories passed down from townsfolk who never forgot the funeral where a child buried himself with his own words. The orphanage still stood. Its walls still swallowed the cries of the abandoned. But now it also held a ghost. The ghost of the boy who had written his own funeral. Nights in the orphanage were the hardest. The prairie winds howled through cracks in the windows, slipping under the thin wool blankets the children clutched to their chests. Dozens of boys slept in long rows, their breathing uneven, their dreams restless. The dormitories smelled of damp straw and unwashed clothes, of fear too thick to hide. But there was another smell, too, because in those late hours, when the matron's lanterns had vanished and silence reigned, one boy would sit upright in his narrow bed. His knees curled beneath him, a scrap of paper balanced carefully on the wooden slats. By the faint glow of the moon, he wrote, not stories, not fantasies, but secrets. The other boys noticed. They whispered about him in the dark. Some thought he was scribbling prayers, begging God to carry him away. Others said he was plotting an escape, a way out of the orphanage's choking walls. But the truth was stranger, more chilling. He was writing the details of his own death. What words should be spoken at his funeral? What hymns should echo through the chapel? Who must not stand near his grave? He even described the coffin itself. How plain, how small, how unadorned it should be. The whispers grew louder among the boys. Why would he do it? What does he know? What has he seen? But no one asked him directly. Fear kept their questions locked inside their throats. In the dormitory, shadows always seemed alive. The moonlight through the windows stretched long and strange across the wooden floor, like fingers creeping toward the beds. Every creak of the building sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind rattling the glass felt like a warning. And in that silence, the boy's scratching pen was a sound that pierced their nerves. It was not the sound of survival. It was the sound of surrender. Some nights, The boys swore they heard him whisper as he wrote, soft words, broken prayers, names no one else recognized. Other nights, he sat still for hours, staring at the wall as though he saw something the others could not. They began to fear him, not because he hurt anyone, but because he seemed already half dead. One night, a younger child dared to peek at the papers hidden under his mattress. What he found made his skin crawl. The words were calm, too calm. No panic, no wild scribbles. Each line carried the certainty of someone who knew the end was near. When the matrons discovered the boy trembling with the papers in hand, punishment came swift. He was beaten for stealing, but the writing was ignored, dismissed, as if a child's plea for a proper burial was not worth more than wasted ink. The boy's letter survived, though. He rewrote it again and again, careful not to lose his only message to the world. In the cold dormitory, silence became unbearable. The children spoke in hushed tones, afraid the boy's words might follow them, might curse them. Some refused to sleep near him. Others claimed they saw his eyes glimmer in the dark, wide and unblinking, as though he was already rehearsing death. The matrons brushed it aside, calling him troubled, peculiar, a child prone to melancholy. But children know what adults refuse to see. They knew something unnatural clung to him. The dormitory whispers spread beyond those walls. Soon, townsfolk spoke of the strange orphan who wrote his own funeral. Some dismissed it as superstition. Others grew uneasy, glancing at the orphanage with suspicion whenever its iron gates creaked open. The boy himself remained silent. His eyes gave away nothing, but his letters told the truth. He was not afraid of death. He was afraid of being forgotten. And in that fear, he left behind something more enduring than his small, fragile body, words sharp enough to haunt a town forever. The paper was thin, almost transparent, the kind that tore easily when pressed too hard. His handwriting was careful, precise, as if every letter had been carved with a blade instead of ink. The words flowed in lines that no child should have written. It was not a diary, not a prayer. It was a farewell written long before his time. The letter began with instructions: how the coffin should be closed, which hymn should be sung in the chapel, whose faces should never be allowed near his grave. It was cold, orderly, terrifying in its maturity, a boy mapping out the ceremony of his own death. But beneath the instructions, something else bled through. The words carried a tone of resignation, of weariness far older than his years. He was not a child begging for rescue. He was a soul laying down his burden, and hidden between the lines was a quiet accusation, not against one person, but against the life forced upon him. The orphanage, the silence of townsfolk, the way no one stepped forward to say, "This boy belongs to me." When the letter was discovered after his death, the matrons insisted it meant nothing. They called it the wild imagination of a troubled boy, the kind who brooded too much. But the townsfolk weren't convinced. They read between the lines. They saw the truth his caretakers wanted buried. He had expected to die young. And worse, he had accepted it. For the children left behind in the orphanage, the letter became legend. They whispered about it in the dormitory after lights out. Some swore the letter carried a curse, that reading it meant you too would die young. Others believed it was a prophecy that the orphanage itself was slowly killing them one by one. What frightened them most wasn't the words themselves, but the calmness of the tone. Children cry. Children fear. Children beg for life. But this boy had written as if death were simply a task to prepare for, a duty to complete. It was not the voice of child. It was the voice of someone who had been broken long before his final breath. The townsfolk began asking questions, though not loud enough to reach the ears of the state. What had happened inside those walls to make a boy so certain of his death? Was it illness? Abuse? Or simply despair too deep to endure? No one could agree, and without a family to demand answers, the questions faded. But the letter remained, passed from hand to hand in whispers, folded and hidden in drawers, spoken of like a ghost story. And in the stillness of the town, people began to notice small details they had ignored before. The way children flinched when a matron raised her hand. The bruises explained away as clumsiness. The way no child from the orphanage ever seemed to smile. The letter had forced them to see. And yet, it was too late for the boy who wrote it. His words outlived him, but they could not save him. They could only haunt those who read them. And so, the coffin was lowered, the hymn sung, the earth shoveled over his body. But the letter, his only act of defiance, remained like a nail driven into the conscience of the town. A letter no child should ever have had to write. The chapel bell tolled slow and heavy, its iron voice carrying across the flat Illinois fields. Farmers paused in their work. Shopkeepers closed their shutters. Mothers drew their children close. Everyone knew whose funeral it was. Everyone knew it was no ordinary burial. It was the funeral of the orphan boy who had written his own farewell. The coffin was small, plain, stripped of flowers just as he had requested. It sat at the front of the chapel, a dark box surrounded not by family, but by strangers. Townsfolk filled the pews in uneasy silence, their hats in their hands, their eyes darting to the folded paper resting on top of the wood. The letter, his letter, some whispered prayers beneath their breath. Others whispered fears about what words the boy had left behind, about what truth they might be forced to face. The minister's voice trembled as he began the service. He spoke of eternal rest, of God's mercy upon the innocent, of a child's soul finally freed from suffering. But even he could not ignore the letter. He did not read it aloud. He dared not. Instead, he spoke around it, as though afraid of the weight it carried. But the townsfolk had already heard pieces. Do not let them near my grave. Sing no song of joy. I am already forgotten, and so I choose to go quietly. The words spread like fire through the pews, carried in hushed voices. A chill settled over the chapel heavier than the autumn air outside. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers shifted uncomfortably, their boots scraping the floorboards. To hear of a boy planning his own burial was one thing. To sit before the very coffin, the letter resting in plain sight, was another. The air felt haunted. When the coffin was carried out, the entire town followed. Men who had never set foot inside the orphanage walked in solemn procession. Women wiped tears from their eyes, though they had never spoken to the boy. Children stared wide-eyed, too young to understand why their parents held them so close. At the cemetery, the coffin was lowered into the earth. The letter was placed inside with him, though some swore copies had been made, hidden away by townsfolk who feared the truth would otherwise vanish. The hymn he had requested, slow, sorrowful, rose over the field. Its notes drifted like smoke into the sky, carrying his final wish into the wind. And then came the silence. Not the silence of respect, but of unease. A silence that lingered long after the last shovel of dirt had fallen. Because everyone present knew this was not an ordinary child's funeral. It was an indictment. The boy had accused them all, not in anger, but in his resignation. By writing his own funeral, he had exposed the orphanage, the town, the world that had left him so alone. The people of Illinois left the cemetery that day changed. Some avoided the orphanage gates from then on, unwilling to meet the children's eyes. Others whispered of reform, of petitions to the state. But most did what humans so often do. They let the silence swallow the truth. Still, the funeral left a mark. For years afterward, townsfolk would lower their voices when they passed the orphanage. Children would dare one another to step inside its gates, whispering about the boy who had predicted his own death. And at the cemetery, his grave stood apart, a mound of earth no one tended, yet no one forgot. The funeral had stopped the town, but it had not stopped the shadows that lingered. The boy was gone, but the questions he left behind had only begun to spread. The chapel stood quiet in the years that followed the boy's funeral. Its wooden beams creaked in the wind. Its stained glass windows caught the prairie sun, but its silence carried more than prayers. It carried secrets. Beneath its floorboards, whispers seemed to linger. The townsfolk who had gathered for that haunting funeral could never walk past the chapel the same way again. They lowered their eyes. They hurried their steps. and in hushed conversations over dinner tables, they spoke of what might have been buried with the boy. Some believed the letter was not the only thing hidden inside his coffin, that perhaps there were more scraps of writing, confessions, names, accusations, that the matrons had slipped away before anyone else could see. Others swore that the minister himself had burned a second letter, one too dangerous to let the town read. No one ever knew for certain, but the air around the chapel grew thick with suspicion. The orphanage remained a shadow over the town. Children continued to march to its gates. The matrons carried on with their stern discipline. From the outside, nothing had changed, but inside, whispers spread among the boys. They claimed the boy's spirit had returned. That late at night, when the lanterns were snuffed and the wind rattled the dormitory windows, footsteps echoed in the chapel, though no one was inside. Some swore they heard scratching beneath the altar floor, as though a hand still gripped a pen, still writing, still begging to be heard. The matrons dismissed it all. Nonsense, they said. Children's imaginations. But their voices trembled when they said it. One winter night, a storm tore through Illinois. Lightning split the sky. The chapel roof groaned beneath the wind. And when morning came, townsfolk found the heavy wooden door swinging wide open. The hymnals scattered across the pews as though tossed by unseen hands. That was when rumors began to grow darker. People claimed the boy had not died naturally, that something had been done to him inside the orphanage, something too terrible to speak aloud. The funeral letter, they said, was his way of warning the world, even as he was silenced forever. For years, children of the town avoided the chapel at night. They told ghost stories of the boy's restless spirit, of candles flickering to life on the altar with no one to light them, of whispers echoing through the rafters that sounded like his voice. The adults scoffed. But when storms rattled the windows, when the bell tolled in the dead of night, without a hand to pull the rope, even the bravest men refused to step inside. The truth remained buried, as secrets often do, beneath the chapel floorboards, beneath the coffin mound in the cemetery, beneath the silence of an orphanage that stood unchanged. But secrets do not rot. They wait. And for those who lived in that Illinois town, the memory of the funeral letter was like a splinter beneath the skin. Never fatal, but never forgotten. The boy was gone, but the weight of what he left behind pressed on the town like a shadow that refused to lift. For a brief moment after the funeral, it seemed as if something might change. The letter had stirred unease. The whispers had grown too loud to ignore. Town officials muttered about forming a committee, about sending inspectors into the orphanage. Mothers urged their husbands to demand answers. Fathers spoke grimly of corruption, of cruelty hidden behind brick walls. For once, the silence felt ready to break. A sheriff's deputy was sent to the orphanage. He walked its echoing halls, nodded at the matrons, glanced at the children lined in rows. They bowed their heads, hands folded neatly in their laps, their silence rehearsed. The deputy left an hour later with a polite report. No wrongdoing discovered. The matrons smiled politely, their starched collars stiff as ever. The gates closed behind him, and the shadows swallowed the truth once again. But the townsfolk weren't satisfied. Some pressed harder. They spoke of the bruises on children's arms, the hollow look in their eyes, the strange quiet that lingered over the dormitories like smoke after a fire. A second inquiry was called. This time, a church elder visited. He left with glowing words about discipline, structure, and Christian charity. A strict home, he said, but a good one. The townsfolk fell silent, not because they believed him, but because they knew they could push no further. The state would not listen. The church would not challenge its own. And with no family to fight for the boy, his death became just another closed chapter. The investigation had begun with fire, with the promise of truth. It ended in ash. The funeral letter was tucked away, its edges yellowing with time. The coffin remained buried. The orphanage stood as immovable as the prairie sky. And so, the town did what towns so often do when confronted with pain too sharp to carry. They turned away. They folded the memory neatly into the past and told themselves it was finished. But the children inside the orphanage knew better. They had seen the men in their suits, the way the matron's eyes sharpened when outsiders walked the halls. They knew the punishments would be harsher now, the silence more enforced. For them, the investigation was not hope. It was danger. They whispered about the boy more than ever in those weeks. They told his story in the dormitory, in the fields, in the hushed corners of the chapel. He became a legend among them, a martyr who had tried to speak the truth but had been buried with it. And slowly, the children began to believe what the matrons could never silence. The boy had not died by accident. He had been erased. The townsfolk grew uneasy again as the years passed. Some claimed the investigation had been staged from the start, that the matrons had powerful friends in the church and the state. Others swore the sheriff himself had been warned to keep quiet. But none of it mattered. The file was closed. The town moved on, and the boy's words, his haunting instructions for his own funeral, lingered only as whispers in the dark. The investigation had promised truth. Instead, it left the town with something worse than lies. It left them with silence. Long after the coffin was lowered and the investigation faded, the boy's story refused to die. It clung to the town like morning fog on the cornfields, heavy and unshakable. Children dared one another to walk past the orphanage gates at night. They whispered about the boy's ghost wandering the rows of corn, his small figure drifting between the stalks, his pale face catching the moonlight. Some claimed he carried a lantern. Others swore he held the very letter he had written, waving it like a warning. Whether the children truly saw him or not, fear lived in their voices. Farmers began to tell strange tales as well. They spoke of hearing footsteps between the rows when they worked late into the evening, of shadows moving just beyond the glow of their lanterns, of a child's faint sobs carried on the wind. They would turn, expecting to see one of their own children lost in the fields. But when they searched, there was nothing, only the endless corn swaying against the prairie wind. And always, always, the sound of the chapel bell in the distance, tolling without a hand to pull the rope. Some said the boy was restless because he had never been claimed. Others believed he haunted the cornfields because the orphanage still stood, still swallowing children the way it had swallowed him. The most superstitious swore that the earth itself remembered him, that the corn grew taller, darker, thicker where his grave sorrow had soaked into the soil. Whatever the truth, the story spread until no child in town dared to walk the fields alone at night. But beneath the ghost tales was something deeper, guilt. The townsfolk may not have spoken it aloud, but they knew. They had seen the signs before the boy died. The bruises, the hollow eyes, the silence too heavy for a child. And they had done nothing. They had looked away, just as the church and the state had. So they carried their guilt in stories. Ghosts in the cornfields, whispers in the chapel, a boy seen at the orphanage window, staring with eyes too pale to belong to the living. Each tale was not just superstition. It was confession. And yet, the children of the orphanage whispered differently. To them, the boy was not a ghost to fear. He was a protector. Some swore they felt his presence on nights when the matron's punishments grew cruel. A shadow at the foot of the bed. A hand that snuffed the lantern so the blows would not fall. A voice that whispered, "You are not forgotten." For them, the boy lived on, not as a restless ghost, but as proof that their suffering was seen. In the end, the cornfields of Illinois held both truths. To the townsfolk, he was a ghost of guilt, forever reminding them of what they had ignored. To the orphans, he was hope, a child who had spoken the unspeakable and lived forever in the echoes of their whispers. But whether ghost or guardian, one thing was certain: the boy had never left. Years turned to decades. The orphanage walls grew cracked and weathered, the paint peeling like dead skin. By the early 1900s, reform movements swept across America. Journalists exposed cruelty inside institutions. Laws were passed to protect children, to place them in foster homes instead of warehouses of sorrow. The Illinois orphanage eventually closed its doors. Its gates rusted. Its halls fell silent. But the story of the boy lingered, carried like a secret through generations. The townsfolk never forgot the funeral. The image of the small coffin, the folded letter, the hymn echoing in the chapel. These memories outlived the building itself. Parents warned their children, don't ignore the lonely. Don't turn away from the suffering. Some even whispered the boy's tale as a bedtime story, not to frighten, but to remind. For the orphans who survived that place, the boy became a symbol. They grew up, left the walls behind, carried scars that never fully healed. Yet when they spoke of their childhood, they always spoke of him, the quiet child who wrote his own funeral, who proved that even silence could be broken by words. Historians later searched for records. Some found fragments in faded ledgers, mentions of a burial without family, whispers of a peculiar letter. But the details have been lost, burned, buried, forgotten by officials who wanted the past erased. And yet, the story lived on. Because a town had seen it, a town had felt it, a town had been haunted by it. The legacy of the boy was not written in books or carved into stone. It was carried in the guilty glances of those who lived through it. In the ghost tales passed around campfires. In the way Illinois parents, for years after, looked more closely at the children who seemed too quiet, too sad, too burdened. He had no name, no family, no inheritance. But he had something greater. He had a story that refused to die. When the chapel finally collapsed in a storm decades later, people swore they heard the bell toll one last time as the steeple fell. When the orphanage was torn down, locals claimed they saw a boy's shadow vanish into the cornfields, as if finally set free. But his words, the funeral letter, remained the most haunting legacy of all. A child, abandoned by the world, had found a way to make sure he would never be forgotten. And so, his story became larger than the town, larger than Illinois. It became a warning across time, that no child should ever feel so unseen that they plan their own burial. That silence can be as deadly as cruelty. That forgotten children leave behind the loudest ghosts. The boy who wrote his own funeral letter may have been nameless in life, but in death, he became unforgettable.